Thunder Rolling Down the Mountain, the story of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce. Chapter 1, Flight, 1877. The Nez Perce people had been on the run from the U.S. Army for more than 100 days. Forced to leave their homeland, they had traveled 1,500 miles. The Nez Perce were exhausted from their long travels and battles with the Army. Just 40 miles from Canada and freedom, they rested at the edge of the Bear Paws Mountains in Montana. On the morning of September 30th, 1877, Chief Joseph prepared to break camp. Wallowa Valley, 1845. Home for Joseph was Oregon's beautiful Wallowa Valley. It was the birthplace of his father and of his ancestors. For centuries, the Wallowa band of Nez Perce lived peacefully in the valley. When the white man came, things started to change. In 1855, the chiefs of the Nez Perce band signed the Treaty of Walla Walla. They gave up some of their land to the United States in exchange for a large reservation. Then gold was discovered in Oregon. Settlers urged the U.S. government to redraw the treaty boundaries. They wanted the gold to lie outside Nez Perce territory. In 1863, the government persuaded several Nez Perce chiefs to sign a new treaty. The treaty took away most of the remaining land. The bands that signed moved to the Lapwai Indian Reservation in Idaho. But in Nez Perce culture, a chief could only negotiate for his own land. Some chiefs, including Joseph's father, refused to sign. The Nez Perce that refused to leave were called non-treaty Indians. In 1871, Joseph's father gave his son some last words of advice from his deathbed. Always remember that your father never sold his country. You must stop your ears whenever you are asked to sign a treaty selling your home. My son, never forget my dying words. This country holds your father's body. Never sell the bones of your mother and father. With his father's passing, Joseph became chief of the Wallowa band. His younger brother, Aloud, became their war leader. Joseph knew that war would not help his people keep their land. He appealed to the U.S. government many times, arguing that they had no right to the Wallowa Valley. In the end, Joseph was told to move his band to the reservation in Idaho. Major General Oliver Otis Howard gave the official order in May 1877. Many of our young men wanted to fight rather than be driven like dogs from the land where they were born. I urge my people to be quiet and not begin a war. Joseph and his people prepared to move. From the very young to the very old, all had to leave their homeland. They rounded up their horses and cattle and collected food for their journey to the reservation. They met up with other non-treaty bands led by chiefs Whitebird and Tohuluhutsu. The bands rested at Tolu Lake before they were due at the reservation. Joseph and Olcott left the camp to check on their cattle. Across the river, when they returned, they received bad news. There have been killings. Some of the young warriors have taken revenge on the settlers. Many white men have died. The soldiers will be after us. Chapter 2, Fight, September 30th, 1877. 4 months later, at Bear's Paw, the Nez Perce were still running from the army. The soldiers took the Nez Perce camp at Bear's Paw completely by surprise. June 1877. After the settlers were killed, Joseph knew they had no choice but to run. They met with other non-treaty Nez Perce at Whitebird Canyon. On the morning of June 17, 1877, 6 Nez Perce warriors waited at Whitebird Canyon. They carried a white flag of truce. One of the soldiers fired shots at the Nez Perce. Hidden Nez Perce warriors returned fire. The Battle of Whitebird Canyon, the first battle of the Nez Perce War, had begun. Aloud and his warriors charged into the troops, frightening the horses and soldiers. Many of the soldiers had little experience with horses and couldn't control their animals. Before long, the army was in retreat. Although outnumbered 2-1, the Nez Perce had a commanding victory. Joseph knew that reinforcements would be called in after the army's defeat. He asked his people to comb the battlefield for ammunition and pistols. They also rounded up cavalry horses to add to their herd. The Battle of Whitebird Canyon had an outcome Joseph didn't expect. General Howard ordered Nez Perce chief Looking Glass and his band captured. They were already living on the reservation, but Howard suspected that Looking Glass warriors were joining the non-treaty Indians. The capture attempt failed, but the soldiers had destroyed the camp. Looking Glass was an experienced warrior and would soon become one of the fleeing Nez Perce's primary war chiefs. With the addition of Looking Glass and his people, there were about 750 Nez Perce on the run. Only about 200 were warriors. The Nez Perce traveled east toward the Bitterroot Mountains. They planned to cross the mountains range and seek safety on the Buffalo Plains of Montana. They entered the mountains and started up the steep Broccoli Willow Trail. The Nez Perce moved peacefully through the Bitterroot Valley. They traded with ranchers and bought goods from shopkeepers. They hoped they had left the war behind them in the mountains they had crossed. On August 8th, the Nez Perce pitched camp in Montana's Big Hole Valley. They believed they were out of danger and slept soundly. But a large force of cavalry found them. They attacked at dawn when the Nez Perce were asleep. Wave after wave of gunfire raked the village. In the confusion, many warriors found themselves without weapons. They took shelter where they could. Unarmed, Joseph hid in the tall grass to protect his child. Not everyone was so lucky. Many people were mowed down by gunfire. Soldiers set the lodges on fire. Women and children were killed. In the chaos of the camp, Looking Glass and Whitebird called to the other warriors to counterattack. Under their direction, the Nez Perce drove the troops back. It was a costly battle for both sides. Dozens of Nez Perce warriors were killed, including some of their best fighters. Adding the women and children, more than 80 Nez Perce were killed. When a soldier dies, 1,000 more take his place. But when a warrior falls, no one replaces him. But as long as we have our horses, we still have a chance for freedom. The soldiers had been unable to capture the Nez Perce horse herd at Big Hole, so the tribes were again on the run. They traveled south along the Bitterroot Mountain Range back into Idaho territory. They turned east toward Camas Meadows. There, the Nez Perce raided the army's mules. Without a packed train to transport supplies, the army's pace was slowed down. The fleeing tribe traveled through Yellowstone and Wyoming territory and back into Montana territory. The Nez Perce turned north toward Canada, traveling through Montana's buffalo country. Wounded and weary, they made camp at the edge of the Bear Paws Mountains on September 30th, just 40 miles from the Canadian border and freedom. The Nez Perce were set upon again by U.S. troops. Chapter 3, Surrender. September 30th, 1877. The U.S. troops attacked forcefully at Bear's Paw. Hundreds of soldiers circled the camp. The battle was fought at close range, not more than 20 steps apart. Joseph's brother, Aloud, was killed. Many other warriors fell, including Chief Tuhuhuzut. By nightfall, the Nez Perce had driven the soldiers from their camp. The men, women, and children dug desperately in the earth, building trenches and pits for shelter. The Nez Perce crouched and shivered in their shelters. They had no fires. Children cried from the cold. The Nez Perce death well cut through the night. Meanwhile, the chiefs discussed their options. We should be patient. Chief Sitting Bull and his Lakota band are close by. They fled to Canada after they defeated the army at Little Bighorn. We should continue to Canada. It's only 40 miles away. I won't surrender. Perhaps those who escape will find Sitting Bull and return with help. Many of our people are out in the hills, naked and freezing. The women are suffering with cold and children crying with chilly dampness of the shelter pits. For myself, I do not care. It is for them I'm going to surrender. If you surrender, you'll be sorry. White men's promises are not to be trusted. Joseph reluctantly agreed to wait for help from Sitting Bull. The Nez Perce waited anxiously. They scanned the horizon and listened for pounding hooves. All they heard were gunshots and the howling wind. There's an Indian approaching the camp. Could it be Sitting Bull at last? A bullet fired from one of the U.S. soldiers struck Chief Lookingglass in the head, killing him. The battle lasted 5 days under driving snow. The army brought in a cannon to bomb the Nez Perce. Everyone suffered from the cold, wind, and snow. I have made my decision. General Howard sent 2 treaty Indians to the camp. They assured Joseph that their lives would be spared if they gave up the fight. Joseph officially surrendered on October 5th, 1877. Tell General Howard, I know his heart. I'm tired of fighting. Lookingglass is dead. Tahulu Suit is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young men who say yes or no. He who led on the young men is dead. It is cold and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I'm tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever.